June 19th, 2007, 03:42 hours, Eastern Baqubah. Staff Sergeant Marcus Webb stood in a building he'd deliberately destroyed. He'd spent 6 days smashing holes through walls, weakening floors, creating structural failures that would make any engineer condemn the place immediately. His platoon leader called it tactically insane. Battalion leadership explicitly forbade it. Other NCOs nicknamed him the architect of clusterfuck. But now, at 03:42 hours, with muzzle flashes appearing from 3 directions and over 100 insurgents closing in, Webb's crazy defensive setup was about to be tested. His platoon, 28 soldiers, was completely surrounded. The quick reaction force was 40 minutes out, maybe longer. The nearest friendly unit was pinned down 3 kilometers away, and somehow, for the next 12 hours, not a single American soldier would require evacuation. So, how does a staff sergeant end up deliberately sabotaging his own defensive position? Marcus Webb wasn't born to be a soldier. He was born in 1979 in Bakersfield, California, to a family that made their living with hammers and levels. His father, Tom Webb, ran Webb & Sons Construction, a small operation handling residential remodeling and room additions. Marcus was the second of 3 brothers, all of whom spent their teenage summers on job sites learning that good work mattered more than fast work. By 17, Marcus could frame a wall faster than most of his father's crew. He understood how buildings distributed weight, where stress concentrated, how structures failed. After graduating high school in 1997, he specialized in structural repairs, shoring up sagging roofs, reinforcing compromised foundations, rebuilding walls damaged by earthquakes. His father told him once, while they were jacking up a 100-year-old farmhouse outside Tehachapi, "Buildings tell you where they're weak, Marcus. You just have to look at the cracks." Years later, that single sentence would save 28 lives in Baqubah. But first came September 11th, 2001. Marcus was 22, working a kitchen remodel, when he watched the second plane hit on a homeowner's TV. His youngest brother, Danny, enlisted in the Marines 3 weeks later. Marcus waited 6 months before walking into an Army recruiting office in March 2002. He chose infantry, 11 Bravo, the simplest designation. He wanted to be where the fighting was. His first deployment in 2003 was conventional warfare, the drive toward Baghdad, the statue coming down in Firdos Square. But his second deployment in 2004 to Mosul was different. IEDs, ambushes, an enemy that wore no uniform and disappeared into crowds. That's when Marcus started doing something strange. Whenever his platoon occupied a building, Marcus would spend hours studying the structure itself, not the tactical sight lines, the building. He'd examine load-bearing walls, test window frames, inspect the roof for weak points, tap walls to find studs, look for cracks in the foundation. His squad leader asked him once what the hell he was doing. "Seeing where it's weak," Marcus said. Other soldiers thought it was weird but harmless. They called him Bob the Builder behind his back. Some called him this old house. Marcus didn't care. He kept doing it. What he was learning, slowly, through 2 deployments and dozens of occupied buildings, was that American soldiers set up defensive positions the way the Army taught them to, focused on outward security and overlapping fields of fire. But they rarely thought about the building as a defensive tool itself. Marcus thought about buildings, the way his father had taught him, as systems of load and stress, with predictable failure points and structural logic. And somewhere in the back of his mind, a question was forming. What if you could turn a building's weaknesses into defensive strengths? By January 2007, Marcus had been promoted to staff sergeant and was assigned to 2nd Battalion, 12th Infantry Regiment at Fort Carson. The battalion received deployment orders for Diyala Province, one of the most violent regions in Iraq. Diyala Province, northeast of Baghdad, had become an al-Qaeda in Iraq stronghold. The provincial capital, Baqubah, was a city of 300,000 carved into neighborhoods by narrow streets and multi-story buildings. The dense urban landscape favored ambush and close-quarters combat. By early 2007, insurgents controlled entire sections of the city. In June 2007, the U.S. military launched Operation Arrowhead Ripper, a major offensive to clear Baqubah. The strategy was aggressive: push into contested neighborhoods, establish patrol bases in cleared areas, and hold ground against counterattacks. This was urban warfare at its most brutal. Every house was a potential battlefield. The enemy knew the terrain intimately, had prepared for months, and was willing to fight to the death. On June 13th, Marcus Webb's platoon, part of Bravo Company, 2-12 Infantry, was assigned to occupy a 2-story house in eastern Baqubah. The house sat at a key intersection, controlling access to 3 major streets and overlooking a mosque that intelligence suspected was an insurgent staging area. The mission was straightforward: clear the house, fortify it, hold it for 10 days. If attacked, they could call for a quick reaction force support, but response times were unpredictable in the chaos of the larger operation. Lieutenant Chen, the platoon leader, was a recent West Point graduate on his first deployment. Competent, by the book, 23 years old. When he briefed the mission, he outlined standard defensive doctrine: fighting positions on the second floor, covering all approaches, observation posts on the roof, reinforced entry points. Then Marcus Webb asked if he could make some modifications to the structure itself. What kind of modifications? Chen asked. Marcus explained what he was thinking. Not all of it, not yet, but enough. Chen frowned. That's not standard procedure, Staff Sergeant. I know, sir. You want to deliberately weaken parts of the building we're defending. Yes, sir. That's tactically insane. Marcus said nothing. Chen stared at him, then shook his head. Set it up by the book, Webb. Overlapping fields of fire, reinforced positions, standard defensive doctrine, battalions watching this patrol base. I'm not explaining to the CO why we turned our own building into a liability. Roger, sir. But over the next 6 days, while Lieutenant Chen ran patrols and coordinated with battalion, Marcus Webb quietly began implementing his plan anyway. So, what was wrong with standard defensive doctrine? The house was typical of eastern Baqubah construction. 2 stories, flat roof, concrete and cinder block walls 12 inches thick. Strong enough to stop small arms fire but vulnerable to RPGs and heavy machine guns. When the platoon first occupied it on June 13th, they followed textbook procedure: sandbags, reinforced windows, firing positions, sectors of fire covering the 3 intersecting streets. M240B machine gun team on the roof, hardened entry points, casualty collection point on the first floor. It looked perfect on paper, but Marcus knew it would get them killed. The problem was line of sight. In dense urban terrain, enemy fighters could approach from dozens of angles: rooftops, alleyways, windows in adjacent buildings. Standard defensive doctrine meant putting soldiers in windows and on the roof where they could see threats coming. But visibility worked both ways, and in Baqubah, being visible meant becoming a target for RPG teams, snipers, and concentrated machine gun fire. American soldiers were trained to think about defense in terms of engagement range and suppressive fire. Marcus thought about it in terms of structural collapse and controlled demolition. Here's what he understood that doctrine didn't account for. If the enemy breached the perimeter, and in Baqubah, with those numbers, they would, then the fight would move inside. Once insurgents were in the building, conventional advantages disappeared. Tight spaces, limited visibility, friendlies on multiple floors. You'd be shooting at shadows, and the enemy would know the layout better within 30 seconds. So Marcus made a calculation. Don't try to keep them out. Control where they go once they're in. On the second day, when Lieutenant Chen took half the platoon on patrol, Marcus gathered his squad and 3 soldiers from another squad he trusted. He told them what he wanted to do. They thought he was insane. But Marcus was a staff sergeant with 2 previous deployments, and they were specialists and privates on their first tour. They followed orders. First, Marcus identified every load-bearing wall in the building, the structural columns that supported the upper floor and roof. He marked them with spray paint, red X's on walls that could not be touched. Everything else was negotiable. Then he did something that violated every instinct of force protection. He deliberately created weak points in the building's defensive perimeter. Using a sledgehammer and pry bar, he knocked man-sized holes through non-load-bearing interior walls on the first floor. Not through doorways, through walls. He created a network of passages that allowed soldiers to move between rooms without ever presenting a silhouette in a doorframe. He turned the first floor into a maze, where you could traverse the entire building's interior without using a single door. Specialist Morrison watched him work. "Staff Sergeant, I don't understand what we're doing. Making sure we can shoot them from angles they don't expect," Marcus said, swinging the sledgehammer into another wall. On the second floor, he did the opposite. He reinforced one corner room with extra sandbags, hardened the walls with scavenged sheet metal, and created a single fortified position with firing ports cut at irregular heights. This room became the bunker, the only position on the second floor intended for sustained fighting. Then he weakened the floor itself. In 3 specific locations on the second floor, rooms that overlooked the most likely enemy approach routes, Marcus used the sledgehammer to crack and partially collapse sections of floor. Not enough to make it completely impassable, but enough to make it dangerous. He removed floor joists, knocked out support blocks, created zones where the floor would creak, sag, or potentially give way under sustained weight. He marked these areas with engineer tape. Danger-floor, compromised. "Staff Sergeant," Private Chen asked, "why are we making our own building unsafe?" Marcus set down the sledgehammer and looked at him. "Because the enemy's going to come inside, and when they do, they're going to look for elevated positions. Second floor, good sight lines. They'll rush up there in the dark, and they won't know which floors are solid and which aren't. But we won't know either. We will, because we're marking them. And we're going to memorize every weak point in this building." The other NCOs noticed what he was doing. Word got back to Lieutenant Chen on the 4th day. Chen found Marcus on the second floor, surrounded by broken concrete and splintered wood. "Webb, what the fuck are you doing?" "Making modifications, sir. You're destroying our defensive position." "I'm redirecting their approach, sir." "Redirecting?" Marcus explained his logic in the calm, methodical tone he always used. "The enemy would attack at night," he said. "Pre-dawn hours when visibility was low. They would come in overwhelming numbers, trying to overrun the position before reinforcements arrived. Standard defensive doctrine assumed you could hold them outside the building with superior firepower and observation. But if they breached the perimeter, and Marcus believed they would, then every conventional advantage disappeared. Once they're in the building, sir, we can't use our advantages. Tight spaces, limited visibility, friendlies on multiple floors. We'll be shooting at shadows. They'll know the layout better than us within 30 seconds, because they've been fighting in these buildings for years. So you're making it easier for them to get in?" "No, sir. I'm controlling where they go once they're in. The passages on the first floor let us reposition without exposure. We can fire from 3 different angles in 10 seconds. They'll think there are twice as many of us. The weakened floors on the second story deny them elevated positions. They rush upstairs in the dark. The floor gives way. They fall. They're disoriented. We know which sections are safe. They don't." Chen stared at the damaged floor, the holes in the walls, the strange asymmetry of the layout. It violated everything he'd learned at West Point. "Battalion's going to have my ass for this." "Then tell them I did it without authorization, sir." "I'll take the Article 15. Chen was 23 years old, responsible for 28 soldiers, standing in a half-destroyed building in one of the most dangerous cities in Iraq. His senior NCO was looking at him with quiet certainty. "How confident are you this will work?" "Confident enough to sleep on the first floor, sir." Chen was silent for a long moment. Then, "You've got 2 more days to finish whatever the hell this is. But if we get hit and it goes sideways, you're explaining it to the CO." "Roger, sir." Over the next 2 days, Marcus completed his modifications. He created 3 separate escape routes from the first floor that didn't use conventional doors. Holes smashed through exterior walls at ground level, covered with plywood that could be kicked out instantly. Emergency evacuation routes for wounded or tactical withdrawal without exposure to direct fire. He positioned sandbags not at windows, where they provide cover but also mark defensive positions but offset from windows, creating firing ports that couldn't be seen from outside. An insurgent looking at the building would see empty windows. The actual firing positions were 3 feet to the left or right, invisible from external observation. He placed the M240B machine gun team's primary position not on the roof, too exposed, but in a first-floor room with firing ports covering the western approach. He created 2 alternate positions so the gun could be relocated in under 30 seconds. Never fire from the same position twice. On June 18th, Lieutenant Chen radioed battalion with a situation report. He described the defensive setup in careful, neutral language, adaptive structural modifications, and non-standard tactical configuration. Battalion wasn't thrilled, but Operation Arrowhead Ripper was hitting heavy resistance across Baqubah. They had bigger concerns than one platoon's unorthodox layout. The platoon ran rehearsals. Marcus walked every soldier through the passage network, made them memorize which second-floor sections were compromised, drilled them on repositioning through the maze. They practiced moving from room to room without using doors, firing from unexpected angles, relocating the machine gun. Specialist Morrison finally understood what Marcus was doing. "It's like we're setting a trap." "Not a trap," Marcus said. "We're making them fight the building as much as they're fighting us." The next night, Al-Qaeda in Iraq launched coordinated assaults on 7 American positions simultaneously across eastern Baqubah. Marcus Webb's patrol base was one of them. 03:42 hours. The first mortar round hit 30 meters west. Marcus rolled off his cot, reached for his gear. Around him, soldiers scrambled into body armor. Lieutenant Chen's voice over the radio: "All stations, stand to. We're taking IDF. Indirect fire. Mortars." Marcus pulled on his helmet, moved to the first-floor observation post. Through the firing port, he saw muzzle flashes across the street. AK-47s. At least a dozen, maybe more. The second mortar impacted closer. 20 meters. Concrete dust rained from the ceiling. Specialist Morrison appeared beside him. "They're coming from everywhere, Staff Sergeant." Private Chen's voice from the second-floor bunker: "I count at least 40 dismounts, multiple directions. Rooftops across the street, alley to the south, vehicles moving up from the mosque. 40 insurgents, maybe more in reserve." The distinctive whoosh of an RPG. Marcus saw the smoke trail. RPG, west side. The impact hit the second floor, punching through a window. It detonated inside one of the rooms Marcus had deliberately weakened. The explosion was muffled, contained by the compromised structure. Smoke billowed out. The building held. "Lieutenant Chen, Webb, we've got multiple breach points. They're coming in." This was it. All personnel, first-floor defensive positions. Execute displacement plan Alpha. Through the darkness, Marcus heard the crash of a door being kicked in on the north side. Shouting in Arabic. Boots on concrete. Insurgents were inside the building. The enemy came fast. They expected resistance at entry points. They found empty rooms and darkness. Marcus watched through a hole in an interior wall as 4 fighters moved past his position, AK-47 sweeping for targets. They were disciplined, moving in a tactical stack, clearing corners. But they were clearing the wrong space. Marcus waited until they passed. Keyed his radio twice. Double-click signal. Specialist Morrison, positioned in an adjacent room connected by one of Marcus's passages, opened fire from an unexpected angle. 3 round bursts, muzzle flash strobing. 2 insurgents went down. The others spun, confused, firing blindly at the wall Morrison had shot through. Marcus moved through his passage, emerged in a third room, fired from a different angle entirely. The remaining insurgents, caught in a crossfire from walls they hadn't known were breached, were dead before they understood the geometry. Contact. First floor north. 4 EKEA. Moving to position 3. More insurgents poured into the building. Marcus could hear them on the second floor directly above. Boots hammering on the compromised sections he'd deliberately weakened. Shouting. Confusion. Then a sharp crack as part of the floor gave way. Someone screamed, a long fall ending abruptly. Private Chen from the bunker. "They're trying to establish positions up here. Floors collapsing under them. Stay in the hard point. Don't engage unless they approach your position directly." The tactic was working exactly as Marcus had envisioned. Insurgents who breached the first floor found themselves in a maze, where walls had unexpected holes, where defenders could fire from multiple angles without presenting targets, where the conventional rules of room clearing didn't apply. Those who tried to use the second floor for elevated firing positions discovered that most of the floor was structurally unsound, fine for the Americans who knew which sections to avoid, lethal for attackers moving fast in darkness. But there were too many of them. A squad of insurgents, 6 fighters in coordinated formation entered through the western breach point. They were better trained than the first wave, using hand signals, checking corners, covering each other's movements. Marcus tracked them through his observation hole but held fire. They were moving toward the central hallway, away from his position. Sergeant Ramirez, positioned in room 5, was directly in their path. Marcus clicked his radio 3 times, standby signal. Then he moved through his passage network, circling behind the insurgent squad. The passages allowed him to traverse the interior in complete concealment, emerging behind the enemy force. The insurgents reached the hallway. Ramirez, invisible behind sandbags in the adjoining room, waited for Marcus's signal. Marcus stepped into the hallway's eastern entrance and fired a single shot, not at the insurgents, but at a metal pipe he deliberately left hanging from the ceiling. The pipe clanged loudly. Every insurgent turned toward the sound. For 1 second, they all turned. Ramirez opened fire from their flank. Specialist Davies fired from a third angle. The insurgents, caught in a triangulated kill zone with no cover, lasted less than 3 seconds. 6 more down. First floor is holding. But the second floor was a different problem. Despite the compromised sections, insurgents were still attempting to establish positions in the rooms Marcus hadn't weakened. They were taking casualties from the unstable floors, but they were persistent. Their numbers were overwhelming. If they secured the second floor, they'd have a massive tactical advantage, firing down through the stairwell, dropping grenades, collapsing Marcus's entire defensive scheme. Private Chen radioed from the hardpoint. "Staff Sergeant, they're massing outside our position. I count at least 12. They're about to rush us." The hardpoint was the strongest position in the building. Sandbag protection, M240B machine gun, limited approach angles. Chen could hold for a while, but not forever. Marcus made a calculation. "Chen, prepare to displace on my command." "Displace? Where?" "First floor. Emergency egress route, eastern wall." The egress route was a hole Marcus had smashed through the second floor's eastern wall that opened onto a first-floor room below. 6-foot drop. It allowed second-floor defenders to evacuate without using stairs or exposing themselves to the central hallway. "If we abandon the second floor, they'll own it," Chen protested. "That's the idea." "Stand by." Marcus moved to the first floor's northwestern corner, directly beneath the second-floor hardpoint. Above him, through the ceiling, he could hear boots, shouting, magazines being changed. The insurgents were preparing to storm Chen's position. He looked up at the ceiling, 12 inches of concrete, supported by steel, rebar, and wooden floor joists. Load-bearing structure, thick enough to stop small arms fire from below. But Marcus knew something about this particular section. When he'd been making modifications 6 days ago, he'd noticed water damage from a leaking pipe. The concrete had been compromised, weakened by years of moisture penetration. He'd considered reinforcing it. Instead, he'd left it exactly as he'd found it. He keyed his radio. "Chen, when you hear sustained fire from my position, execute egress immediately. Don't hesitate." "Roger." Marcus braced his M4 against his shoulder, angled it upward at 45 degrees, began firing full auto into the ceiling. The 5.56mm rounds punched through the weakened concrete. Chunks of material rained down around him. He emptied a 30-round magazine, reloaded, fired again. The ceiling cracked, sagged, then gave way in a cascade of broken concrete and rebar. Above him, insurgents screamed as the floor collapsed beneath them. Bodies, weapons, debris crashed down into the first-floor room. Dust filled the air, choking, blinding. Through the chaos, Marcus heard Chen's team executing the emergency egress. Boots hitting the first floor, soldiers calling out positions. The second floor, already compromised by Marcus's modifications, was now partially collapsed in the section where insurgents had been massing. Those who hadn't fallen through were retreating, shouting warnings, trying to reorient. Marcus moved through the dust cloud, weapon up, found 3 insurgents alive in the rubble, dazed, injured, weapons buried under concrete. He engaged clinically. 3 round bursts, no hesitation. Second floor is denied. All personnel maintain first-floor positions. For the next 7 hours, the pattern repeated. Insurgents would breach the perimeter, enter the building, and find themselves in a structure that defied their expectations. The maze of passages, the collapsed sections, the unpredictable sight lines. Everything combined to neutralize their numerical advantage. They couldn't establish positions, couldn't coordinate effectively, couldn't understand why the buildings seemed to fight them as much as the American soldiers did. Marcus moved constantly, repositioning through his passage network, directing fire, adjusting the defense as the enemy adapted. His soldiers, initially skeptical of his crazy setup, now understood the genius of it. They were outnumbered 5-1, but the building itself was a weapon. The M2 40B gunner, relocated to a first-floor position after abandoning the second floor, fired controlled bursts through firing ports Marcus had pre-positioned. Each port offered a specific angle of fire that covered key approach routes while minimizing exposure. The gunner never fired from the same port twice in a row, creating the illusion of multiple machine gun positions. Specialist Morrison, bleeding from shrapnel wounds but still fighting, used the interior passages to appear in 3 different rooms within 60 seconds, each time firing from an unexpected angle. The insurgents began shooting at walls randomly, wasting ammunition on ghosts. Lieutenant Chen, his West Point training overwhelmed by the reality of close-quarters urban combat, followed Marcus's directions without question. He coordinated ammunition resupply, managed casualty collection, maintained radio contact with battalion. But the tactical leadership belonged to Marcus Webb, the staff sergeant from Bakersfield who'd spent his youth learning how buildings failed. At 0730 hours, as dawn light began filtering through the dust and smoke, the intensity of the attack diminished. Insurgent bodies littered the approaches to the house. More lay inside, in the rubble of the collapsed second floor, in the hallways and rooms of the first floor. The survivors were pulling back, dragging their wounded, disappearing into the warren of streets. Marcus, standing in the central hub room with his weapon still raised, heard the distinctive sound of Bradley fighting vehicles approaching. The quick reaction force, delayed by simultaneous attacks across the city, had finally arrived. Lieutenant Chen appeared beside him, face gray with exhaustion and dust. We held. Marcus lowered his weapon. His shoulders ached from the weight of his gear. His hands were bleeding from cuts he didn't remember receiving. He could taste concrete dust in his mouth, feel the grit in his eyes. We held, he confirmed. Around them, the building stood, battered, partially collapsed, full of holes and structural damage that would make any engineer condemn it immediately. But it had done its job. It had turned the enemy's numerical advantage into a liability, their aggression into confusion, their assault into a killing ground. 28 American soldiers had survived a 12-hour siege against an enemy force estimated at over 120 fighters. 0 friendly casualties required evacuation. Some shrapnel wounds, cuts and bruises, ringing ears and exhaustion. But everyone walked out. By the time battalion leadership arrived 3 hours later, the platoon had moved to a new location. Engineers had already declared the original house structurally unsound and scheduled it for demolition. Lieutenant Colonel Hayes, the battalion commander, stood in what remained of the first floor and tried to understand what had happened. The interior looked like a demolition zone. Holes in walls, collapsed sections of floor above, debris everywhere, bloodstains on concrete. The defensive layout made no tactical sense according to any doctrine he knew. Who designed this? He asked. Lieutenant Chen, standing at attention despite his exhaustion, answered carefully. Staff Sergeant Webb made structural modifications to support the defense, sir. Modifications. Hayes looked at the maze of passages, the deliberate weak points, the asymmetric geometry. This looks like he took a sledgehammer to our own position. He did, sir. Hayes examined the evidence of the battle in silence. Then, where's Staff Sergeant Webb now? With his squad, sir. Setting up the new patrol base. I want a detailed after-action report. Full timeline, tactical decisions, everything. Hayes paused. And I want to know how a staff sergeant with no engineering training knew to do this. The quick reaction force found 73 dead insurgents in and around the building. Dozens more were estimated to have been wounded and dragged away. It was one of the most lopsided defensive engagements of Operation Arrowhead Ripper. The after-action report was completed 2 days later. Battalion S3 reviewed it with quiet amazement. The intelligence officer cross-referenced it with similar engagements across the theater. Nothing quite like it appeared in any existing database. Marcus Webb was called to battalion headquarters on June 25th. He expected disciplinary action for violating standard defensive protocols. Instead, Lieutenant Colonel Hayes informed him he was being awarded the Silver Star for gallantry in action. Technically, Hayes said, you violated about 6 different regulations setting up that defense. Yes, sir, but you saved 28 lives and killed 73 enemy fighters. Marcus said nothing. How did you know it would work? I grew up in construction, sir. My father taught me how buildings fail. I just applied that to how buildings defend. 3 weeks later, Marcus was pulled from line duty and assigned to work with combat engineers and tactical training officers. They wanted him to document his methodology, to explain the structural logic, to determine if it could be taught. He spent 2 weeks filling notebooks with diagrams, measurements, and explanations of load-bearing principles applied to urban defense. The resulting document, Adaptive Structural Defense in Urban Environments, was distributed to training commands and included in pre-deployment briefings for units heading to Iraq. It wasn't officially adopted as doctrine, too unconventional, too dependent on individual assessment, but elements of it began appearing in urban warfare training. At the National Training Center at Fort Irwin, California, instructors started teaching soldiers to think about buildings as dynamic defensive tools rather than static containers. They taught the principle of controlled structural failure, deliberately weakening non-critical sections to deny enemy occupation. They taught the geometry of interior passage creation, the logic of asymmetric knowledge, the tactical advantage of making your own defensive position appear chaotic while remaining structurally coherent. They didn't always mention Marcus Webb by name. The case study was often presented generically, a platoon in Baqubah, but the soldiers who'd been there knew, and the technique became known informally among combat engineers and infantrymen as Webb's Maze. Years later, researchers at the Army's Center for Army Lessons Learned would list the Baqubah defense as one of the most innovative tactical adaptations of the Iraq War. They noted that it represented a fundamental shift from treating buildings as obstacles to treating them as weapons, a concept that required construction knowledge, tactical creativity, and a willingness to violate established doctrine. Marcus Webb was promoted to Sergeant First Class and extended his deployment by 4 months to continue advising on urban defensive positions. He returned to Fort Carson in January 2008, was assigned to train the next rotation of deploying soldiers, and was told he'd likely be promoted to Master Sergeant within a year. He declined re-enlistment instead. After 8 years in the Army, 4 deployments to Iraq, and a Silver Star he kept in a cardboard box in his closet, Marcus Webb returned to Bakersfield, California in March 2008. He was 29 years old. He married his high school girlfriend, Jennifer, who'd waited through all 4 deployments. He went back to work for Webb & Sons Construction, now run primarily by his older brother after their father retired. Marcus worked as a senior foreman, specializing in structural repair and renovation. He coached youth soccer on weekends. He and Jennifer bought a small house in East Bakersfield, 3 blocks from where he'd grown up. They had 2 daughters. He never spoke much about the siege in Baqubah. When other veterans asked, and they did, occasionally, when word got around about the Silver Star, he would pause for a long moment before answering. I just did what had to be done, used what I knew. If they pressed for details, he'd shrug. Buildings tell you where they're weak. You just have to look. He attended memorial services for soldiers from his battalion who hadn't made it home. He stayed in touch with some members of his platoon. Lieutenant Chen, who'd gone on to serve 3 more deployments, called him once a year on June 19th, the anniversary of the siege. They'd talk for 10 minutes, sometimes less, mostly about family and work. Neither of them needed to say much about that night. It was there, between every sentence, in every pause. Marcus Webb lives quietly in Bakersfield today, age 46, still working construction, still coaching soccer. His daughters know he served in Iraq and that he won a medal, but they don't know the details. Jennifer knows more, but even she's heard only pieces of the story, offered in fragments over the years when nightmares woke him or when news from Iraq brought the memories back. There's a small memorial at Fort Carson's battalion headquarters for soldiers of 2-12 Infantry who died during Operation Arrowhead Ripper. Marcus's name appears on a different plaque, a short list of Silver Star recipients from that deployment. Most people walk past without noticing. But every year, a dozen or so veterans make their way to Bakersfield. They're soldiers who served with Marcus, or who heard the story and wanted to meet the man who'd turned a condemned building into a fortress, who'd violated every regulation and saved every life. They find him at work sites, covered in dust, carrying lumber or examining foundation cracks. They shake his hand, thank him, sometimes just stand there for a moment without knowing what to say. Marcus is always gracious, always humble. He offers them coffee, asks about their lives, deflects any talk of heroism. When they leave, he goes back to work. There are buildings to repair, structures to shore up, load-bearing walls to reinforce. It's honest work, the kind his father taught him, the kind that matters when done right. Sometimes, when he's examining a cracked foundation or assessing a damaged wall, he'll pause and run his hand along the concrete, feeling for the stress points, the weak places where the load concentrates. And for just a moment, he's back in Baqubah, standing in a building that shouldn't have held but did, proving that understanding how things break is the first step to understanding how they endure. There's a temptation to call stories like this myth. It's easy to think that wars are won by overwhelming firepower, superior technology, and massive force projection, by airstrikes and armor columns and the machinery of modern military dominance. But the truth is, wars are also won by people who understand things the manuals don't teach, by soldiers who bring knowledge from other lives, construction workers who see buildings as systems, mechanics who understand machines intuitively, farmers who read terrain like a language, by people who, when doctrine fails and the situation demands it, trust what they know, even when everyone else calls it crazy. Marcus Webb wasn't a tactical genius. He was a construction worker who'd spent his youth learning how buildings distribute weight and where they fail. He simply applied that knowledge to a problem the Army hadn't taught him how to solve. He didn't win the war, but he saved 28 soldiers, killed 73 enemy fighters, and changed how the military thinks about urban defense. And in war, sometimes that's everything. What would you have done in Marcus Webb's position? Would you have trusted your instincts and violated doctrine, knowing you might face disciplinary action if it failed? Would you have had the courage to deliberately weaken your own defensive position based on construction knowledge most soldiers didn't have? What shocked you most about this story? The fact that he survived, the casualty ratio, or the way he turned structural weakness into tactical strength? Did you know that the Iraq War produced innovations like this, born from individual ingenuity rather than institutional planning? Let us know in the comments below. If you believe that forgotten heroes deserve recognition, that unconventional thinking sometimes saves lives, and that the best solutions often come from people who bring unexpected knowledge to impossible situations, share this with someone who needs to hear about Marcus Webb and the siege of Baqubah. Because sometimes, the smartest defense is the one that looks like madness until it works.